Thank you, Professor Heckman. To follow up on the inspiring ideas presented by Professor Heckman, we will now conduct a panel discussion and followed by a Q&A session. Now, for the panel discussion, the session will be moderated by Professor Richard Wong. Professor Wong is the Chair of Economics at the University of Hong Kong and Philip Wong Kennedy Wong Professor in Political Economy. So, Professor Wong and Professor Heckman, please.
Hear me? Okay. Well, Professor Heckman, it was a great talk. Thank you very much for being here. And I wish you had done your research 50 years earlier and my mother had listened to you. I was in the audience. Well, let me start off with a few questions while the audience is gathering the questions. In terms of the intervention, could you give us one or two examples of interventions that your groups and other collaborators have studied of intervening in disadvantaged children in, say, rich countries like the United States, and also interventions in poorer countries like India or China, so that we can have a better sense of what type of interventions, you don't need to be comprehensive, but some things that you found, you learned, and that were important.
Take it up. Yeah. Okay, good. So we made our view. So let me, no, here, I'll turn this off. Okay. That should run it. No, it's still not. Let me do that. Okay, so there are a lot of aspects, but you mentioned rich versus poor, so just to cut to the chase. Certainly in poor countries, very poor countries, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about some parts of Southeast Asia, for example, Cambodia, Laos, in Indonesia, or even Papua New Guinea, where you actually see serious challenges to basic nutrients. These aren't just the stimulation of the family. This is like the stimulation of vitamins, minerals. There was a famous example that was given a few years ago. Everybody knows that, I don't know if everybody knows, probably nobody knows. Does anybody know the name of the Sherpa who accompanied, who climbed, really helped climb Mount Everest for the first time? Tenzing thing. But there was very famous quality. The Sherpas were a group of people living in Nepal. And the view was that Sherpas always had this hump shape. If you ever looked at Sherpas, they all seemed to have this hump. And even though the mythology, well, having this hump was really useful for climbing mountains of high altitude, nobody knew anything. Well, it turned out many years later, when the World Health Organization and other organizations went into Nepal, that hump was immediately a consequence of reduced iodine. So literally, by giving these people iodine, the hump left. The Sherpas are still very good at climbing mountains. The hump had nothing whatsoever to do with it. But it's really this very low level of nutrition. So I do think there is a baseline level of nutrition and baseline level of education where if people, can't read or write, they're seriously challenged. So in the poorer countries, the challenge is greater. It really is greater. There's also another notion, in the very poor traditional areas, there's a lot more resistance to even things like education. We saw, for example, in West Africa, when the Ebola pandemic went around, and health professionals went there, there was this fear that many of the groups had that these people coming in, these health professionals, were actually spreading the disease as part of a plot or something. So we know that at very low levels, there's a real challenge to sort of acquainting, and in some sense, intervention or boosting skills that take children away from the traditional family can be a real challenge, not just in less developed countries, and certainly in developed countries as well. So there is a challenge that's kind of universal of kind of colliding against what some people would see as family values, and traditional practices, and so forth and so on. Or, notion that girls shouldn't get education, or this group should be treated this way and that, or that parenting style should be in a certain way. So that's one challenge. But the other challenge in even more advanced countries, where education is common, is understanding the role of the family. That's the challenge politically, but it's also understanding the role of the family from the point of view of public policy. Most people, at least in the U.S., it became very fashionable, starting, I guess, 100, 150 years ago. Fashionable is the wrong word, but it was entrenched that, we had what was called the common school. Everybody could go to the common school, and that schooling played a very powerful role. And the schools would be the main vehicle for social mobility. And they certainly are our main goal. But what people didn't understand, especially 150 years ago, was that families are playing a fundamentally important role, both in supporting the child in the school and in sending the child to the school in the first place, with a level of skills, motivation, and so forth. And so one of the challenges, political challenges, actually in the United States and in many countries, has been to get people aware that the family plays such a powerful role, and then to confront an issue which is very much a hot-button issue. Namely, some interventions, especially early childhood interventions, are interventions that are viewed as interfering with the role of the family. So, for example, many years ago, when Richard Nixon was president of the United States, there was a plan put forward to have kind of like an enriched head start. I think Walter Mondale, actually, the senator, put that forward. And Nixon vetoed it, and under advice from many people. Nixon wasn't a stupid man, and his advisors weren't stupid. But they really said, well, the early years were really years for the family. So there were both religious and social notions that you're interrupting with the family. And I think that's something that's true. The family plays a very important role. It has to be recognized. But the way that these interventions and the way that should be understood and have come to be understood and are successful, the reason why these ideas are becoming more successful is that successful interventions are not replacing the family. And they're not telling children what their values should be. They're giving supplement to the family. And so it's all voluntary. It has to be voluntary. You need the family to be a partner. And secondly, you need to understand the structure of how to collaborate and enrich the family life, rather than basically impose some rule, and not to adopt a common set of values. I mean, the idea, one of the reasons why I depart a little bit from Sim and some of his work, is that he also has this notion about what a good life is. And I'm a little more eclectic in what a good life is. But I know what good skills are. And those I think we would promote. So I think the challenge really, and let me give you, I know you didn't want to go on this long, but let me give you one example which I think is relevant. And it's not a Chinese example. But in the United States, 50 years ago, a very wise man working, again, in the Lyndon Johnson administration, named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, wrote a report. Moynihan wrote a report, and the report was basically talking about the pathology of the African American family. And it was the Negro family, that was the term. And at the time, 28% of all African American children were born out of wedlock. Now it's close to 80%. That's another study. The point is that he said that single-parent families, at least in the United States, typically were under-resourced, were not providing environment, and this would create a problem for the next generation. He was violently attacked. Violently attacked. The phrase that was used was, you're blaming the victim. That what you're doing is that these are victims of slavery, and so there was a notion, and then the other notion is that somehow blacks have that smart and skills or form. So it got tied in with genetics, it got tied in with a bunch of arguments which are completely irrelevant. I think what's happened now with the modern understanding is understanding that things like IQ, personality traits, talent, are things that we can affect and we can promote in a positive way. by supplementing the family. And I think that has been part of the challenge. It is now becoming much better accepted. So instead of casting, so there's a whole litany. I don't know how many of you read this book 20 years ago by Charles Murray. Murray's done some very good work, but Murray wrote this book called Bell Curve. And what he was arguing was the black-white difference in America had to do essentially with an IQ difference. That blacks were dumber as a group than whites, and that this was genetically determined and there wasn't much you could do about it. And I think all the that's pretty inflammatory. So actually, in the end, he was saying that poor people should be put on reservations, kind of like the U.S. has put American Indian tribes. They're just beyond the pale. Look, these early interventions for disadvantaged children boost IQ points. We know if you start earlier, that's the dynamic. So I think that's part of it. It's a political challenge, but it's also, I think, a challenge where you say, we're not boosting, we're not telling people how to live. We're giving opportunities for people to choose the way they live. I think it has to be framed as a voluntary program, and one that supplements it. That's a long way. And then there's just a lot of ignorance, which is out there, I think, both in less developed and developed countries about the nature of education. So schools are very important, but they're only part of the story. Most of what schools do is what actually how parents interact with children in school. So
a little bit, Jim, and something that many of us can easily get confused. How is your early childhood intervention different from, say, President L.B. Johnson's Head Start program? What are the distinguishing differences? Because it's very easy that a Head Start is starting early, and early childhood intervention is also starting early. And Head Start didn't work, so why early childhood works? What's the difference between the two?
Okay, see, that's a very good question, and it has multiple aspects. What I would say was, first of all, when Head Start actually does work. It's a very interesting thing. There's a recent experiment done in the United States, last 5-6 years, very controversial. But the experiment basically randomly assigned people to Head Start and then randomly denied others. And then you ask, what are the effects? Okay, well, two things. First of all, it's a short-term follow-up. That's an important part of the story, but let me leave that to the side for a moment. These programs were actually instituted now. We're talking 2008, at a time when there were many, many childhood programs. So people who are randomly assigned or randomly denied have many choices. So it turned out, when you looked at the choices of people who were randomly denied the program, many of them went to other Head Start programs. Head Start's very decentralized. You go to one Head Start program, be denied there, but you can go to another one in the neighborhood. It's based on you, and it's certainly in disadvantaged neighborhoods or families. Multiple family members are living around the neighborhood. So you can basically undo the randomization. So we think of a randomized controlled trial as an ideal, but basically this was a case of comparing apples to apples. It sounds like a good thing to do, but it was literally the same apple in many cases. So finding no effective Head Start was really an effect of saying the people in the control group were getting more or less the same treatment as the people in the treatment group. So that's part of the story. So when that problem has been addressed, Pat Klein and Berkeley, there's some others working on this as well, we find actually stronger effects. But the second thing, and this goes back now many years, this goes back to the late 60s, that the first evaluation of Head Start, where there wasn't a substitution phenomenon going on. It's a good example of economics. People have choices. But the other part of it had to do with the fact that when people said Head Start didn't work, they said it didn't boost IQ. And in fact, it didn't. And in fact, a lot of these programs, especially when they start after age 3 or so, don't boost IQ. And at the time these program evaluations were being made, people thought that IQ was the be-all and end-all of who was successful. So if you were smart, high IQ, you were going to succeed. If you had low IQ or not, so if it didn't raise IQ, it couldn't have worked. Well, fortunately, around the same time as Head Start, there was something called the Perry program. It did have a long-term evaluation. The Perry program just like Head Start, early rise, maybe richer, probably better level of resources given to the disadvantaged children. But what it did do is it followed these children for up to age 50. We actually have an experiment, a follow-up right now, which we're now about to finish, about to write up. We're collecting the data, and we'll start writing it up, where these people are now 50 years of age. And what do we find? Just like Head Start, the people in the treatment group who got an enriched family stimulation, those children actually are much more successful. They're not any smarter. Their IQ is exactly the same as the control group. But these other dimensions, these multiple dimensions of skill, that's the part that's missing in so much of the evaluation. Nobody was even thinking about that in the late 60s. So in some sense, we're looking under the street light of IQ, but social and emotional skills, health, all these other dimensions, nobody ever thought an early childhood program would have any dimensions on them. So as we come to look at more comprehensive measures, we can see that those other skills are basically augmented, but on top of it, they pay off in practical terms. So there's less crime, huge reduction in crime between the treated and the controlled group. Very substantial. And it turns out to be lucky. The very kids were 3 to 4. It turns out criminology, a lot of recent work, Terry Moffat and others, has shown that 3 to 4 is about the onset of aggressive behavior of hardened criminals. So if you target those years, you can actually have serious prevention, which literally happens, substantially lower crime. And so what happened is we looked at crime, we looked at earnings, we looked at education, we looked at health. We see a huge number of outcomes nobody ever thought about doing. So in 1969, people were thinking only of the IQ test. And in 1969, you correctly noted, people in Head Start had no higher IQs than those not. But if we go forward 40 years, in some of the better programs, Head Start has a lot of other issues. That these multiple dimensions of evaluation play a huge role in shaping what the structure is of successful programs, and it's documented. And this by itself, even though it sounds like a bunch of something way away from economics, this is now, these are the very capacities I was talking about. They map into the performance of the skills in life. We boost those. We boost the performance. So that's, we can go on about aspects of that. Those are some of the main lessons that come from it. So, by the way, Head Start started at 3. There's an early Head Start program that starts at earlier ages. And we know for certain things like boosting IQ and other kinds of reduction in stress and promotion of certain development processes, earlier could sometimes be better as well. So there was a lot that we didn't know about human development 50 years ago. And we learned a great deal more precisely because we evaluated it, where people came in, we started looking at it, and then we had this nice symbiosis between economics and biology.
One of the issues that you discuss is the development of IQ seems to pretty much level off after 10 to 12, which has a lot of scientific support. But subsequent skills, social emotional skills, can continue to develop all the way up to 25 or 20s. What lessons, based on all that research, do you draw from conducting education policy around the world regarding primary school, secondary school, and college? I heard once a Stanford director of admissions said, all the students who got the top grades tend to work for those who are barely made it through Stanford, and went to parties. So is that the lesson we should draw?
True that there are multiple skills that are required for success. The skill required to set up a business successfully, to stay the course, certainly intelligence is an important factor, but also the capacity to recognize opportunities, to interact with others, to control oneself, control even one's emotions, but certainly control the way that one would perceive, the amount of patience, discounting, whether or not more impulsive versus less impulsive. All of these are hugely important factors. Your observer, I think, is probably correct that a lot of other skills are extremely important. And I think that's the lesson to be learned. But the other part of your question has to do with the sense of what do we learn from the fact that these personalities and aspects of self-control or decision-making evolves. So we know that an 11-year-old is probably less capable of making decisions than a 17-year-old, everything else the same. And probably a 21-year-old is more successful than a 17-year-old. And that has a biological basis. Literally, when neuroscientists now look at the brain and look at the areas of the brain that are used in decision-making, you start seeing literally still an ongoing process of forming the matter, forming the white matter, forming the connections that are still emerging. So what does all that mean? It means that there's a lot of malleability that's still there. And secondly, precisely because it's not just about IQ, but it's also about how well you use the IQ that matters. What economists would call comparative advantage plays a huge role. So what are the tasks that you use? So if you think about what's the skill that's basically focusing almost solely on IQ, probably one example, one of the best examples, is proving a theorem in mathematics. Just a very abstract theorem. Although even there, conscientiousness plays a very important role. Think about it, right? I mean, remember this guy who proved Fermat's last theorem? He locked himself in his attic for 10 years, diligently working at this theorem, only collaborating. So, Thomas Edison and Einstein and others frequently stated the point that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think that's a relevant finding. So these multiple traits matter, but you can turn it around to your advantage. First of all, suppose you get children from disadvantaged circumstances who are 14 years of age. What can you do with those children? From a purely economic standpoint, there are real benefits that can be made by starting earlier. But suppose it's too late, kid's 14. There still are ways to shape those social and emotional skills. And what we've come to learn is it's exactly what successful mentoring programs, successful apprenticeship programs, workplace-based training programs are doing. So even if the children do not have a high levels of sort of initial cognitive skills, what you can do is encourage them and promote those basic skills. And they're and doing so can be effective. So we have a recent paper that was put out by the OECD that goes through interventions over the whole life cycle. Right? Question. And so what we summarize what effective interventions are. And so I have a graduate student he's now leaving to go on to take a job elsewhere. But he has done a very successful, a very interesting study of a program for inner city children in Chicago. What does it do? These aren't the best, they're not the worst. They're inner city, predominantly African American. What is he doing? He's taking mentors for these children, giving them advice. Or not he, but this group of people, giving them advice. And he's then following them, encouraging them to go on to college or at least get some more advanced education, and encouraging them in the next step after they leave high school. Following them in that activity, he finds that many more of them they're encouraged, and they're giving this mentoring, what I call scaffolding. If they have that kind of activity, they're far more successful. So I think that's the broader lesson, is that it's not all over at age 3 or at age 1. I mean, we're very resilient. That's the amazing thing. There was a book written by an anthropologist many, many years ago called The Children of Hawaii. It's a study of children growing up in great disadvantage in Hawaii. Almost everything is against those children, if you just look at the socioeconomic status. But what happened was those children were highly successful, many of them. Why? There was this resilience. They found a mentor, a parent, maybe somebody in school, somebody outside their life, even if family life itself was fragmented. So we are a lot more flexible. I get worried about saying, everything is over at age 3 or age 5 or age anything. But I'll tell you for sure, it's a lot easier to learn at age 3 than it is to learn at age 83. And I think we know that as well. That's an example of dynamic complementarity. But the point is that yes, I think it's the fact that we have the multiplicity of skills and the multiplicity of critical and sensitive periods in forming those skills, they give us a much richer economic and social policy than we used to have in the past. So it's not all over. That's what I worry about. Some of the advocates get so worried about 16 months, 8 months, and those are important years, and we learn them. But all of life isn't determined in the first 6 months. An important part is, but it's remediation.
All these questions that you put forward. Let me ask you one other question, and that is, when you talk about the importance of the family environment, very often in the United States, in Hong Kong, you think of, the parents. But in many parts of the world, and certainly for people of a slightly older generation, grew up in very large families. Sibling learning is very, in your research, have you looked at sibling learning? I mean, sometimes they have half a dozen, maybe a dozen siblings. The gap, the young actually learns from the old rather than from their parents. Have your research covered sibling? And what are your thoughts about, one-child policy as a consequence of constraining people to reduce the sibling learning opportunities?
When it's been studied, and there are studies that Joe has how every paper exactly about, in this case, it's actually the parents using the older child in some sense setting a precedent, which is useful for the younger children. But yes, in fact, some of the successful interventions particularly successful, have precisely the quality that older children are teaching the younger children. And that has a two-way flow, because the younger children, of course, respect the older children, learn from them, but the older children themselves are learning how to teach and govern others, so they're interacting in a way. And so there really is learning going on both ways. So yes, the extended family, the grandparents play a huge role. And in fact, even now, in a lot of places, whether it's South Africa, or in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Chicago, or some of the North American cities, you'll see that the mother frequently is more central figure in the life of the child than the mother herself may be. But this notion of learning from children, but learning from others too, peers and so forth, that's very important. And it's not as well researched as it should be. But there is evidence, for sure, some that the older children are teaching, and that is a source. If children are raised too much in isolation, then there are serious consequences that come from that. That's been one of the problems that people have made in the U.S. and criticized about homeschooling. So if you have small family and homeschooling, when children are not playing with other children, they're learning. They're losing the possibility of learning a variety of social play, just learning from others, peer learning, and just sibling learning. I brought them together towards a form of social interaction. And we know that that's an important component, but it's not as well understood as it should be. It simply hasn't been investigated in Europe. The tools are there, and the data are there. It simply just hasn't received that much attention.
And this is about a phenomenon which in the United States is called tiger mums. Whether this will create something called large amount of resources are devoted by parents, particularly tiger moms, in their children, private tutoring, attending, traveling, community work, service, and so forth. From the very early years, some play Mozart while they are still in the fetus. Does this not exacerbate social inequality solutions? Because well-functioning families are investing so heavily in children, whereas disadvantaged families are not only not getting the parental, but maybe even the interventions aren't there. So, what are your thoughts about how to address these sets of issues?
Well, you're exactly. I completely agree with the point of the question. That well-functioning families are enormously successful in producing children. John Dewey, who for a while was in Chicago and then spent most of his life at Columbia University, had this famous phrase saying that successful schools do what successful families do. And I would say successful preschools probably also do what successful families do. So this gets back to the question of target. Yes, I mean, I don't think we need to target very advantaged families, rich families with money isn't always the solution. It's not always a question of wealth. I offer as an example Paris Hilton, knows Paris Hilton. She's a very wealthy heiress, and I wouldn't argue that she is a very good example of a successful, productive life. News. But so family life, though, generally more advantage than resource families have, give their children great advantage. So there's no question. So the focus of the target should be towards disadvantaged families, I think. And then, but you're absolutely right that you're getting what's called, so now there's a question. This is a big question. So I'm not into saying, well, we need to, but it gets into the debate of universal versus targeted intervention. So that's why I want to mention it. So if you really believe, and I think most of the evidence supports, if you give an advantaged family additional resources, whether it's higher quality schooling, whether it's better place schools and the like, every bit of evidence from recent studies has really suggested that the family complements that. Instead of putting resources, taking resources out of them, it actually puts more resources into them. Now, that's not to say it's not a good idea to do that, but it also suggests that if budgets are limited, as they almost always are, that some of the most effective interventions from a purely financial standpoint would be those targeted towards the disadvantaged families, where there isn't that same kind of parental input and response, and creating the nature of the parental response changing for the intervention, so that precisely you get the same behavior in disadvantaged families that you don't get in advantaged families. Namely, that when you offer the family, disadvantaged family, more schooling, then the parent realizes because they can play a role in intervening, encouraging of the child, helping the child with homework and so forth, this can be a major source of advantage. Now, let me get back to one other thing, which is the tiger law. I know I've skirted around the question. But I've talked to Grace Chang. You know Grace very well. She's Lars Hansen's wife. She's of Taiwanese origin. Her father, of course, played a major role in forming the Taiwanese economy years ago. And she always likes to make the distinction between the authoritarian mother and the authoritative mother. So the authoritarian mother is one without interaction, laying down the law, and really not listening much to what the child's going on. The authoritative mother is one who's basically staying with the child, tracking the child. But the last one, which is what you're getting at, is also another notion about parenting. I'm not a child development expert in the sense of telling you I've done all of these interventions. I've read a lot, I've interacted a lot. We have some experts here drawn on the Dean Round, when we talk about it. But this notion of what's sometimes called a helicopter parent, where the parent is always present and somehow shaping the life of the child, really misses what I think we've come to understand. We had a session about this earlier this week here at the university meeting. And that is that there really is a very important role to play and for non-structured learning in the life of the child. So essentially, play is a wonderful thing. All these, it's studied, Richie Davidson, many others have documented this, but it's kind of commonsensical. I feel very lucky. When I grew up, I had a good family, not particularly rich, but good kind of resources, good, certainly no starvation and the sort. But it also gave me a lot of free time. I could go to the library, I could go out and play, I could meet. And I think what's happened, at least in the United States, I don't know the situation, but I do know in Korea, with this practice of hapon, in Japan, I don't know the situation in Hong Kong, that there has been this very structured study. And this is kind of pathological, because people are studying for the exam. So they're studying to pass the exam. Because the exam is so important, it starts crowding out other aspects, even of learning. So that if you think about it, we certainly saw that in the United States with No Child Left Behind. As these schools got held to accountability on an exam, they started dropping music classes, physics, things that weren't tested. So we know that people respond to incentives. This was a very strong incentive to do well on a certain set of topics tested. And so in that sense, by not giving a lot of, by being too focused on this particular mission, you're going to lose the capacity of children to play and benefit from these kinds of, I would say, non-didactic learning, which I think we've come to understand is an important part of learning.
One question is, I think you pretty much covered this, but let me just ask this, and then you may wish to elaborate a little bit. What's the best way to promote these socio-emotional skills when sometimes parents, perhaps, may not have them? When parents find it missing, now that, for reasons, maybe either their own personality, their background, what have you. And how do you deal with this issue? Perhaps sometimes even the family resists your intervention. And how do you handle that?
Well, the resistance issue is a serious one. I don't know if it's empirically serious, it's quantitatively serious. My experience, and the experience that I've garnered from others working on this, has been that most families, not all, if offered the opportunity to offer a better life for their children, will take it. I think that's the general rule. I think that's a very high proportion. But certainly there are families where they're used, they aren't interested, they're offered these possibilities, they won't take those possibilities and feel very negative about it. And that's an issue. And that's an issue that is a good issue. Actually, John Stuart Mill talked about that question, and many people are worried about the question, where you get the child really who's a ward, in some sense, of the family, and if the family is not providing kind of baseline set of skills, then it can be serious. So that's where I come along and think about supplementation of family life. So it's ignoring your extreme situation where people really need ill for the child. We know that happens. There are mothers who don't want the child, sometimes abandon the child. I put it in a garbage can or something. There are stories like that. It's not common, but it happens. But in the other cases, where the family themselves, learning by imitation is a huge part of learning. We imitate others, little children especially. Imitation. And again, an understudied component of learning, but it is very important, especially when you're young. So the family role models of just how they behave, maybe the violence. For example, one example of what some people would call bad parenting is inconsistent parenting. The child will be encouraged, discouraged, encouraged. That can lead to a kind of withdrawal of the child from any kind of activity, kind of creating a defensive shell. So then, what can you do in that circumstance? I think you can offer supplements. So I think what you can do is, assuming that the family means well, the child is given some opportunity to find other examples, to get some encouragement. I don't think we ever want to be in a position, Plato talked about taking the kids away. Plato was talking about social inequality. The way to get rid of it was have a universal system of orphanages. All children taken away from them. He was right that the family was important. He was dead wrong in saying take the family out of the life of the child. Because every time you tried to do that, and people have tried to do that, the Aborigines in Australia, in the U.S., we had a program where indigenous children were actually raised in reservation schools. That's always led to a serious set of emotional, psychological problems for the children who had no parent. Parent bond is very important. I think we have to recognize the centrality of the parent's role and then just inform, work with them, give them the opportunity. And then you raise the logical possibility. Some may not take it. That's true. That may not be. At that point, we get into a value question, which I think is real. I don't know if we really want to be in a position with abusive families. Yes, if they're going to start killing the child or torturing the child, then that's, of course, something we can accept. But short of that, is not that encouraging, you can only go so far. That's part of what I think the sanctity of the family has to be respected. But I would just give the child more options in the sense of providing some other supplements in the family. And then engage and recognize that working with the family. An example of this is these interventions in the United States called the Nurse-Family Partnership Act. What does it do? These are teenage girls that are basically having their first pregnancy. Most of these people, many of these are 14 years of age, 14, 15. Most of them high school dropouts. They're not very educated, not very skilled. Their parents themselves weren't very educated. They don't have a very good example. Sometimes they don't even know basic facts. When you are carrying a child, it's not a good thing to smoke and to drink, and to use drugs. And they're told that. Given that information, many of the parents change their behavior. So providing information and providing role models, Fabio Cunha systematically investigated. But it is true, though, when we do studies. Cunha has done this, Annette LaRue, an anthropologist, has done this, but many others have done this. There really is a widespread variance among populations about what a good parenting style is. And there may even be a notion of the Confucian family may not exactly having the same values as the Western family. Probably the view of respecting authority. Maybe, I think that is certainly a contrast. And by the way, one of the sources of resistance is taking a sort of purely Western-based program. But still, within that family, there's a very strong encouragement of the child to succeed and support. And so the question is, you have to respect the sanctity of the family. You've got to get the parent as a partner, and more than a partner. You can't say, tell the parent what to do, but you can't offer the information. You can't say, well, there might be a better way. Frequently, when parents are told, some parents we found in the United States, this is work that was done by psychologists 20 years ago, that very disadvantaged parents had spoke to their children many fewer words. So there was a notion you don't talk to the kid, leave the kid alone. And there are certain Indian groups in the United States that still have this. There are certain ethnic groups around the world that have this value. But there's also a sense, too, some of those families, that they don't encourage the child. And many of the language is one of saying, don't do this, instead of saying, this is what you can do. So you can tell these by factual information, by information to parents, yes, we know that this actually promotes better function in children, will make a better, more successful life for the children. But I think there's a boundary. You have to respect it. You've got to work with the family. You've got to respect the family. But then I would say this, that in the U.S. there's been a huge adoption of these early childhood programs. And where? In states that are typically not pro-Obama states. These are so-called red states, in the Middle East and in the Midwest. And when you're looking at places like Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. Say why? Because these same programs are actually strengthening the family. And so the argument has been one of promoting family values and strengthening the family. Couch on these terms, which I think is a valid way to couch these things. These become politically and socially very effective. You're not telling people not to believe in a certain way of life or not to do certain things. What you are telling them is, here's how you can make your child more successful. Give that child maybe the opportunities you didn't have yourself. That's pet residents in areas that are typically very much anti-government programs or just intervention, period. It's not intruding, so it's not what makes them fear. It's not going in and telling parents what to do. It's going in and helping parents do what they want to do. I think that's the important part, the volunteerism and the fact that you can get children. I don't think any family wants to have children that are dumb, unhealthy, and violent. I don't see very many families having, maybe Sparta, 500 BC, wanted warriors, but even there, I bet you they wanted their warriors to be highly disciplined and intelligent and healthy. So even in Sparta, I would guess, although I don't know.
Okay, thank you, Jim. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hear you present your talk and also engage in this dialogue. But time really flies. It is a little bit past 11:30, and we think you've given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the audience really appreciates you.
Thank you, Professor Heckman.